Hi, we're
Hi.
joined we're joined by Melisa Cran, a program manager of RegionsAdapt initiative at Regions4 Sustainable Development. Thank you, Melisa, for accepting the invitation. Um, could you tell us what is RegionsAdapt and what do you do through its community of practice?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Mayra, for having us. So RegionsAdapt is one of the climate initiative of Regions 4. So just a little about Regions 4. We are a subnational network that have been around for 20 years. And we work with states, province, and regions in three lines of work, which are climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable development, all with the idea of trying to bring those subnational towards resilience. And in our climate program, one of our main initiative is the RegionsAdapt initiative. The RegionsAdapt initiative is the idea of bringing subnational government together to accelerate climate adaptation. So we really focus on adaptation. The idea we unite around 70 members and we help them see what are the different steps of the adaptation cycle, like, for example, assess vulnerability assessments, do ambitious adaptation planning, help them see how to implement adaptation actions on the ground, and also monitor and report on those actions. So in those different lines of work, we do advocacy, but we also try to help states and regions communicate, participate, and that's why one of our main activities are community of practices.
And what exactly do you do through the community of practice with the regions?
The idea is to try to offer a safe space to our members to really discuss between peers about their challenges and about the best practices. We think so. Our community of practices are only open to our members. We decided to really try to these are exclusive webinars to our members, and the idea is that we will, for each community of practice, select one topic which is around the adaptation cycle. So sometimes it will be about how can we mainstream adaptation policies, how can we develop finance for adaptation at a subnational level, how can we think, we had a discussion last year on water, how can we measure adaptation progress. And the idea is every time to bring one guest expert. So with the idea of capacity building and access to expertise, and we will always start our communities with a one guest expert that will help us either frame the discussion with a scientific background, either present a useful tool that we think that might be of interest for our members. And then after this introduction, we will invite different regional government to share what they've been doing on the ground. We've pre-selected before each webinar 2 to 3 regions, and we give them the floor to a little bit share with other regions what they've been doing, and then we will always keep a third part of our sessions more as an open floor to really let the floor to other regions, either to ask more questions and go more in depth in the presentation, or to ask to present what themselves have been doing on the ground. So really our two main of ideas is like knowledge exchange and peer-to-peer learning, but also capacity building and access to expertise.
Amazing. How can communities of practice like yours support regions in their climate adaptation process or pathways, and what benefits can a community of practice bring to regions in this adaptation process, in your view?
I think in our view, one of the key element is that it allows to bring it allows to always keep up to date to evolving needs and evolving topics. For example, we've seen in the last years that there's a growing topic on climate justice. And this year, we're really looking at what does that mean there's lots of discussion about environmental justice, about climate justice, but what can that really mean for climate, and what can that really mean for adaptation planning at subnational government? So I think something that is great through communities of practice is it allows to discuss hot topics, or to discuss current trends, and to make sure that to share a little bit of knowledge on those topics. Another thing that can be very interesting is I think community of practice also give the possibility to bring diverse expertise and diverse stakeholders, right? In our case, it is true that because these are webinars that are exclusive to members, we mostly have like policymakers or staff from regional government, right? But we could imagine community of practice organized by a region, and then there have a great diversity of experts. We actually already have that a little bit in our community of practice, because although we work a lot with contacts with often are from the climate department, because one of our strong focus is like cross-sectoral and mainstreaming, we often invite them to identify other experts from other departments to try to give us another view, focus on adaptation section, adaptation planning. For example, last year we had a community on a practice on mainstreaming adaptation, and we actually had one representative from social housing in Wales that explained and shared her experience of what does that mean, like integrating adaptation into social housing. So I think something that's great with community of practices, it gives you really the possibility of integrating different perspective and different expertise.
That's great that you mentioned that. Because my following question was, why is it important for regions to engage with different types of stakeholders during this adaptation planning and implementation? And in your experience working with them, have they mentioned specifically which kind of stakeholders are mostly involved, or which are most key to be involved in these communities?
I think actually this is really something that we're looking into this year, because at the end of the year we'll be doing a RegionsAdapt report that will focus a little bit on climate justice, as I mentioned. And we saw that in the different dimensions of climate justice, there's like recognition, making sure that diverse perspective, right, is represented. There's also procedure, which is ensuring that there's in the process of making decision, making sure that everyone is included, and making sure the impacts and that, because everyone can have a different a voice, right? So making sure that everyone is included. And distribution, which is like looking at how does the impact but also the benefits go to. And I think that on that, we have seen and discussed with some regions that have shown that when reviewing their adaptation planning, or when implementing new ones, taking into account citizens, taking into account the diversity of stakeholder is really more and more important. Like, for example, we had an example from Catalonia, who has created their Mesa Social sobre el Cambio Climático, which is like a social forum on climate change, where in this example, this forum that started last year, they really selected 65 representatives for all sectors, with the idea to really reflect the diversity of the Catalan university. And they really work with academia, business, civil society, citizens, really with the idea of trying to represent all the different voices. And also something we found interesting in the different interviews that we're doing, what we're looking at happening on the ground, is that subnational government is also very aware that vulnerable communities sometimes are lacking access to this kind of decision making or this kind of procedures. And we see that in the adaptation planning, KwaZulu-Natal, for example, when they did their review, they really tried to do both online workshop and physical workshop that could really go to really go to types of people that are not necessarily in heard, which are more vulnerable communities. For example, you'd have like the indigenous or the low income, and these are types of voices that are not often heard. And we see that it's important to also allow them to include them, right? Sometimes even giving representation. For example, KwaZulu-Natal, they've included in their climate change council elected representative of vulnerable communities such as women. So these are those kind of inclusion of the diversity of stakeholder that we find very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's great. Also because we found that these types of populations, vulnerable communities are often the most affected. That's why they're called vulnerable communities. They're most affected by the impacts of climate change. So giving them the space and make sure that they are including, also bring their knowledge as being their most affected is key, I believe, as well. And touching upon what you said about making that make sure every voice is heard or included. We often see that a key factor for a successful community of practice, let's say, is having a structured governance framework, right? So in your experience, what are the steps to develop a successful governance framework? Meaning, how do you work together with different stakeholders that you are including in the community of practice to take decisions and act on them, making sure everyone is represented?
I think on that, there's a very important part, right, which is communication and information, right? For us, we feel that it's very important to have we see that our regions really, for them, it's very important to get their messaging through civil society, academia, and everything. For example, yearly we ask our regions to report through the CDP states and regions questionnaire, which allows us to see a little bit what kind of actions our states and regions doing on the ground. And we can really see in the past years that awareness campaigns or capacity building workshops with citizens is really a rising issue. But I think that this goes beyond the idea of involving a stakeholder. This goes back right to the idea of how do we do good adaptation planning? How do reach different the different communities, and how do we manage a good governance? And on that, the factors that we have identified is like a strong institutional framework, policy, and instrument. Like sometimes having like decrees or laws that are really pushing the climate agenda forward. This is really helped to have also like the political adhesions of decision makers. As I mentioned, yes, knowledge is very important, but knowledge not only in capacity building, but also in data. We feel that it's important also to have a lot of data on impacts and on trends, and it's also important to share them because it's citizens or business we see have really great interest in understanding what's happening, and this helps them take ownership, right, of these challenges. So data is really one of a key element that we see. We've noticed that a lot of regional government are actually developing open platform to share with citizens what are the finding at a territorial level. Of course, there's always multi-governance because This is especially true for states and regions because they're more intermediary, right? But in multi-level governance, you always have the idea of working with all the different level of governance, because adaptation action will not happen. Needs to, yes, you need a collective efforts from everything, but multi-level governance, not only vertically with the different like national, municipal, and different level, but also horizontally, making sure that it's cross-sectoral and making sure that it's with all the different level. And of course, one of the main challenges is the access to financial resource, but that's whole topic on its own.
It's exactly a topic of its own. That's great. You mentioned data and sharing data as a way of creating co-ownership, no? Because the more aware you are of the impacts, the more it makes you potentially to act on it as a citizen or as a business. So in your experience as well, what has proven successful to create a sense of co-ownership and continuous engagement in your community of practice? Specifically, it's hard because sometimes we don't, most keeping the resources, keeping the interest at hand, and also being fully virtual can prove a challenge. But what would you say has proven successful so far, and what have been lessons learned as well?
I think something that proved useful is putting the emphasis on relevance and frequency. I think relevance because it's very important to have topics that are close to your audience center of interest, right? So it's very important to assess what does your audience wants to learn about, because you could have the greatest webinar with the greatest experts, but if this is not relevant to your audience, they will not participate, they will not attend. So I think there's as a preparation, there's really a lot of scoping what are the different topics that could be selected, and really choosing the ones that are of interest for the most of your audience. And I think another thing is frequency. For example, we chose to have at least 2 community of practice per year, but our members know that they can count on this, right? So it could be annual, of course, it could be anything, but just the idea of making this a regular meeting, so that they know if they participated in the first one and they enjoyed it, they know they have another one to look up for, and to know more or less when it will be. Yeah, I think frequency is also very important, and something we focused on in the past years, which was not necessarily at the case at the beginning, but we found interesting, is try to make those community also useful, those webinar also useful after they're being held. So have output documents, have outcome documents with key messages and key recommendations that can be shared either with the participants so they can remember what was discussed, but also more broadly to really try to give value to the discussions that are being held in the webinars. I think this is something. Let me think. Something else, yeah, that we have not been able to test, but I think that could be interesting. Would be to explore like open communication channels, like forum or discussion boards. I think it could be, especially for I guess a local and regional government. It could be interesting to provide a space for a participant or citizens to engage after the discussion, or to share information. And something else that we haven't tried out that could be interesting also is having a, so as I mentioned, for the moment, we are having more workshop with guest experts and regional government sharing on their cases. But we could also imagine like a workshop on co-creating solutions, right? This is something, especially with the evolution of technologies, this is something that can be also done online, because they're like digital tools that can really allow for a collective thinking towards a common goal. So this is something else that we haven't tried out yet, but I think it could be also very interesting.
That's great. That's perfect. Any other final thoughts or recommendations that you would give for a region that is looking into starting a community of practice in their region?
I think what we noticed is that, for example, we've been doing this in the past 2 years, and our audience is still strong because people actually enjoy having access to information and enjoy having this opportunity of an open floor where they're allowed to be voiced. So we've had very positive feedback from regions, and I'm sure that if region also do it at their own level, it would also be welcomed in a very positive light. So it's definitely a bit of planning. Oh yes, something I would emphasize on would be like prior communication. I think it is very important for, especially for webinars, that you really communicate with save the dates and prior communication to make sure that the information is disseminated. So yes, it does take a little investment in preparing a little bit of communication material and identifying who do you want on at your table of discussion. But then the discussions are very interesting, and it can also lead to a positive momentum. So I think it's definitely a interesting experience that we really recommend regional government to look into.
That's great. Thank you so much, Melissa, for your time and for your invaluable input on how to create a community of practice in adaptation.
Thank you, Myra. It was great sharing.